The wooden door slammed hard. "Please, I need help," Tobin shouted. A woman appeared in the doorway. She looked the dust-covered man up and down. In his arms, a baby cried without stopping. "My wife died from childbirth complications. It's been a week. My son is starving. Please, he needs milk." The woman looked at the baby. Then she closed the door. It was the 10th door that day. 10 doors, 10 refusals. A baby starving in his father's arms. Tobin didn't know it yet, but on that very same road, 3 orcs would cross his path, and after that encounter, none of their lives would ever be the same. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back 3 days earlier. He had buried Sarah 2 days ago. No ceremony, no priest, no neighbors to bring bread or sit with him in silence. Just him, the cold ground, and the oak tree at the edge of the property. The one she had always said she liked, because it was the only one that gave real shade in August. He dug with both hands at first, then found the shovel behind the barn. He didn't remember the exact moment. He barely remembered anything from those hours. What he remembered was her voice. "Take care of him. Make him happy. Promise me." He had promised. Thomas had been crying since before they left the cabin. A thin, weak cry. Not the sharp, demanding wail of a healthy newborn. Something quieter. Something that made Tobin's chest tighten every time he heard it, because he knew what it meant when a sound grew small like that. He had tried cow's milk diluted with water on the first day. Thomas spat it out and cried harder. He tried again. Same result. By the second day, the crying had grown weaker, and Tobin had understood with a clarity that left no room for denial. The boy needed a wet nurse. There was no other way. He rode to the nearest settlement, a cluster of farms and trade posts pressed up against the old war boundary, tied his horse, knocked on the first door. A woman with flour on her hands looked at the baby, then at him. She said she was sorry. She closed the door. He knocked on another. A man said his wife had just weaned their youngest and didn't have milk to spare. The door closed. A third door, a fourth. Each one the same. A different face, a different excuse, the same result. Tobin did not beg. He had never been a man who begged. But by the 7th door, he was close to it. And by the 9th, he had stopped caring about pride entirely. He adjusted Thomas against his chest, steadied the horse, and kept moving. One settlement left in range, one more try before he ran out of his own kind to ask. The horse had nothing left to give, but it kept walking, same as its rider. The wooden door slammed hard. "Please, I need help," Tobin said. A woman appeared in the doorway. She looked him up and down. The dust, the hollow eyes, the bundle in his arms. Thomas was crying without stopping, not the strong cry of a baby making demands. The thin cry of one running out of time. "My wife died from childbirth complications. It's been a week. My son is starving. Please, he needs milk." The woman looked at the baby. Something crossed her face. Not cruelty, something smaller and worse than cruelty. She closed the door. It was the 10th door that day. Tobin stood on the step for a moment. The sun was already past midday. His horse waited at the post, head low. Thomas cried against his chest, softer now than an hour ago, and softer than that was the direction things were going. He looked at the closed door for a long moment, then he turned south. He told himself it was because he had no other choice. That was true. But somewhere under that truth was something harder to name, a kind of shame about what it meant that 10 doors of his own kind had already closed. The trail narrowed between 2 walls of pale stone. The wind dropped. Thomas made the thin sound, barely audible now. Tobin spurred the horse gently, and then he saw them. 3 figures on the trail ahead, still, watching him approach. The afternoon sun was behind them, and for a moment they were just silhouettes, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in leather and bone. Then the light shifted, and he saw the green of their skin, the dark braids, the ornaments of crystal and carved bone that caught the light. Orcs. His hand moved toward his rifle out of habit. He stopped himself. Thomas made the small sound. Tobin breathed in, breathed out. 10 doors. He spurred the horse forward. The 3 orcs did not move when the human came toward them. Vola watched him from the center of the trail, hand loose near her belt knife, eyes reading his posture the way she read everything, quickly and without sentiment. The man rode badly. Not because he was a bad rider, because he was exhausted. His shoulders curved inward. He held something against his chest with one arm while the other managed the reins. Something small. She heard it before she understood what it was. A thin cry, almost no sound at all. Beside her, Ratha took a step forward. Vola held out one arm. Not a stop, just a wait. They watched the man dismount. He nearly fell, caught himself on the saddle horn and straightened, turning to face them. Dushra made no sound behind them. But Vola felt her go still in a different way, the way a body goes still when something reaches it that it wasn't expecting. The man lifted the bundle in his arms. His face was dust and dried tears and too many days without sleep. "My son needs milk," he said. His voice was steady but only just. "His mother died. He's very weak. Please, anyone." Silence. Vola looked at Ratha. Ratha looked at Dushra. Dushra's eyes were fixed on the bundle, on the small pale face just visible above the wool, on the barely moving chest. "I had a son," Dushra said. Her voice was low, not directed at the human, at no one in particular. "He was 2 months old, born weak. We did everything, but he didn't make it." The human didn't speak. 12 days ago, Dushra continued, "my body hasn't forgotten." She stepped forward. Vola didn't stop her this time. Dushra reached the human and stood in front of him for a moment. Green eyes on blue, 2 people measuring each other across a gap that the whole broken world had spent years making wider. Then she looked at the baby, and something in her face settled, the way a decision settles when it has already been made before you realize it. "I still have milk," she said. The human's jaw worked. He looked at his son, then back at Dushra. Then, slowly, like a man who had held on too long and finally understood that holding on was the wrong instinct, he held out the baby. Dushra took him. She took him with both hands, naturally, the way a body remembers what the mind is still grieving. She settled him against her chest. The baby cried, faint, exhausted, then found what he needed and went quiet. The silence on that trail was different from the silence before. Vola watched the human's face change. It didn't collapse, it just opened. Something behind his eyes that had been locked for days came loose, and his hands dropped to his sides, and he stood in the middle of a desert road while tears made tracks through the dust on his face. He didn't wipe them. "My name is Vola," she said. "That is Rata, and she is Dushra." The man looked at her, swallowed. "Tobin Vask." Vola nodded once. "Come with us." She turned and started walking. Behind her, Ratha fell into step, and Dushra walked slowly, carefully, one hand supporting the baby's head, singing something low and guttural that was not quite a song, more like a sound the body makes when it is remembering how to be whole. Tobin led his horse behind them without a word. Above the scrubland, the sun moved toward the hills. No one looked back. The Grakthar camp sat between 3 low hills, hidden from the main trail by a fold in the rock that looked like nothing from a distance. Tobin wouldn't have found it alone. He wouldn't have tried. He followed the 3 orcs through a gap between boulders, and then the camp opened up ahead of him. Leather tents arranged in a wide circle, cook fires sending thin smoke into the fading sky, children running between the adults' legs. A smell of roasting meat and dried herbs that hit him like a wall after days of trail dust and grief. Everything stopped when he entered. Every pair of eyes in that camp turned toward him. Children froze mid-step. An older orc near one of the fires put down his ladle slowly. A young warrior with fresh scars on his forearms moved his hand toward the long knife at his hip. Tobin kept walking. He kept his hands visible. He did not look away from anyone. Dushra was still carrying Thomas. The baby had fallen into a half-sleep against her chest, the deep, relieved sleep of a body that has finally stopped fighting. She walked past the staring faces without breaking stride, as if the tension in the air simply did not apply to her. The elder came from between two of the larger tents. He was not the biggest orc Tobin had ever seen, but he moved like someone who had never needed size to command a room. His face was cross-hatched with old scars, not the random scars of accident, but the deliberate kind, the kind carved with intention. His vest was decorated with runes pressed into bone plates. His eyes were the dark amber of old wood, and they moved over Tobin the way a craftsman looks at a piece of material, assessing, not hostile. "Stranger," he said. His voice was like rock grinding on rock, but precise. "Your son will live here for now, but nothing in this world is free." Tobin looked at Thomas in Dushra's arms, then back at the elder. "I'm listening." The elder's name was Corum. He spoke plainly, the way men speak when they have seen enough war to find words like courtesy and diplomacy wasteful. 3 years before, a conflict with the Drakvol clan had nearly destroyed the Grakthar. Not a border skirmish, a war. Half their warriors were dead. The women who remained were building a future from rubble, and a future needed men, families, children. "The arrangement is this," Corum said. "Your son will be fed and cared for. You will stay 5 days. You will come to know Vola, Ratha, and Dushra. At the end of the 5th day, you will choose one of them to marry. If you refuse—" Tobin saw it coming before Corum finished. "You leave. Alone." The word landed in Tobin's chest, like a stone into still water. He turned to look at Dushra. She was watching him with those steady, deep eyes, the baby still sleeping against her shoulder. Thomas's small hand had curled loosely around the edge of her leather vest. "You can't take my son from me," Tobin said. His voice held, barely. "We are not taking anything," Dushra said quietly. Thomas stirred slightly, and she adjusted him without looking. "We are giving you a choice. Save your son and build a life here, or leave and carry that weight forever." The camp was very quiet. Tobin looked at his son's sleeping face, dry lips slightly parted, the faintest color beginning to return to his cheeks from the milk. He thought of 10 closed doors. He thought of the woman who hadn't even let him finish the sentence. He thought of Sarah, and of the promise he had made while she was still breathing. He looked at Corum. 5 days, he said. The first morning, Vola took him to the stables. Not to impress him. Vola was not the kind of woman who tried to impress anyone. She took him to the stables because that was where she spent her mornings, and if the human was going to be in the camp, he might as well be useful. The Grakthar horses were something else. Stocky, broad-chested animals with legs built for rocky terrain, nothing like the lean southern breeds Tobin was used to. Vola moved among them the way she moved everywhere, directly, with purpose, with no wasted motion. "They come from the Vethkara Mountains," she said, running a hand down the neck of the largest one. "Before the war, we traded them as far as the Iron Coast. Now—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Tobin saw the gap. Half the stalls were empty. War took horses the same way it took everything else. "You know horses?" she asked. "Enough. Enough is enough." She handed him a brush. "Start with the grey." He worked beside her for 2 hours. They didn't talk much. But when they did, Vola was direct in a way that surprised him. Not rude, just honest. She wanted the best herd on the frontier. She had plans, specific ones, which bloodlines to acquire, which traders to approach when travel became safer, which terrain suited which breeds. She spoke about it with the calm certainty of someone who was going to do it, whether the world cooperated or not. Tobin listened. He noticed that she never once mentioned needing a husband. The 5-day arrangement existed for the clan. Vola herself seemed to want something more specific than an agreement. She wanted to be chosen, not bargained for. Meanwhile, at the edge of camp, Ratha was watching the child. Thomas was awake and fussing after his morning feeding. Dushra had handed him to Ratha while she went to tend the cook fire, and Ratha walked him slowly in the thin morning sun, pointing at things and naming them in her language: rock, fire, sky, bird. The baby tracked her finger with his eyes. He had stopped crying entirely. Ratha noted this without sentiment, but with attention. The baby was smarter than he looked. He was taking in information. She approved of that. She also noted the iron fatigue in Tobin's posture when he crossed the camp, the way he moved like a man who had been awake for too long and was too afraid to sleep. She began cataloguing, without fully deciding to, the plants that grew in the hills above the camp: feverbark, nightroot, the low grey herb that, when boiled into a tea and sweetened with a little honey, could make a body remember how to rest. She filed this away for later. That evening, Tobin sat near one of the smaller fires while the camp settled into its nighttime rhythms around him. Children were called in. Fires were banked. Somewhere in the largest tent, Dushra was putting Thomas to sleep, and Tobin could hear, just barely, the low, guttural sound of the lullaby. He stared into the coals. The young warrior with the forearm scars sat down across from him, not friendly, not hostile, just present. "You're the human who came to us," he said in rough common tongue. "I am. You're not afraid." Tobin looked at him. "I am," he said. "I'm just more afraid of something else." The warrior studied him for a moment, then nodded, a short, specific nod, and got up and walked away. In the largest tent, Thomas sighed in his sleep. Dushra listened until she was sure he was out. Then she allowed herself, for the first time in 12 days, to cry. On the second morning, Ratha was already at his tent entrance before he was fully awake. "Drink this," she said. He took it, smelled it, looked at her. "It's not poison," she said evenly. "It's nightroot and feverbark. You're not sick yet, but you will be if you don't sleep. This will help." He drank it. They walked through the hills after that, Ratha moving ahead, pointing out plants she stopped to collect. She explained each one without condescension, the way a person explains things they love, the ones that close wounds without scarring, the roots that draw infection out of a puncture, the moss that, when packed against a deep cut, could hold a man's blood inside him long enough to reach shelter. "You're a healer," Tobin said. "We don't have that word," Ratha said, "but yes." She stopped at a shallow depression in the rock where a group of low grey plants grew in clusters. She knelt, pulled 2 from the ground gently, and handed one to Tobin. "Smell it." He did. It smelled like dry rain and something faintly sweet. "Good for grief," she said simply, then kept walking. Tobin looked at the plant in his hand for a moment before following. Back in camp, Vola was repairing a section of fence beside the stables, driving stakes into the hard ground with the methodical force of someone solving a problem. She did not look up when the young warrior, Drak, approached. "He's not a bad man," Drak said. "I didn't ask," Vola said. "You're thinking about it." Vola drove another stake. "I think about everything. That's different from feeling it." Drak watched her work. "Dushra already feels it." Vola stopped for one moment, then kept working. "Yes," she said, "I know." That evening, Ratha brewed the grey herb into a tea and brought it to Tobin without comment. He drank it, lay back in his tent, and was asleep within minutes, the first real sleep in over a week. He dreamed of Sarah, not of her dying, of her laughing at something he had said, her face turned toward the summer sun, her hand on his arm. He woke in the middle of the night to the sound of Thomas crying. He was already on his feet before he was fully awake. He crossed the camp in the dark and found Dushra already at the baby's side, lifting him carefully. Thomas calmed almost immediately. Dushra looked up and saw Tobin in the tent entrance. Neither of them spoke. She held the baby toward him slightly, a small gesture, an offering without demand. Tobin came forward and sat beside her, and for a while they were just two people in the dark, with a child between them who had already begun to understand that this woman was safety. Tobin watched Dushra's face while she looked at Thomas. He recognized that expression. He had seen it in mirrors in those first hours after Thomas was born and Sarah was still alive, and the whole world had briefly felt like it made sense. He looked away. Outside, the hills were very dark and the stars were very bright. By the third day, Tobin had stopped counting the stairs. He worked. That was all. He asked Vola what needed doing and did it. Fixing a hinge on the stable door that had been rusting for months, sharpening blades on a whetstone he found in the supply tent, looking at the cracked leather on 3 sets of harnesses and asking if they had needle and thread. They did. He sat in the afternoon sun and worked the leather while children crept closer and closer until one of them, a girl, maybe 4 years old, with small bright eyes, reached out and touched his boot and then ran away, shrieking with laughter. Tobin looked up and found Rata watching him from across the camp with something that was almost a smile. That afternoon, Rata took him further into the hills than before, past the plants and into the rocky upper ground where the view opened up, south to the scrubland he had ridden through, north to where the mountains turned blue in the distance, east to the pale flat expanse of the frontier territories. "The war," Tobin said without really planning to. Rata kept walking. "What about it? Did you lose anyone?" A pause. Not because she didn't want to answer. Because the true answer was long and she was deciding how much of it to use. "My brother," she said, "and a woman I grew up with, and 23 others whose names I still say in the morning when I wake up." Tobin said nothing. "You?" she asked. "I wasn't a soldier." "That wasn't what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "My father's forge was burned. He rebuilt it. 2 boys I grew up with didn't come back. And the hate it left behind." He stopped. "I think the hate was worse than the fire. The fire you can rebuild over. The hate just—" He didn't finish. "Grows," Rata said. "Yes." They stood at the edge of the ridge for a while. Below them, the camp was a small cluster of smoke and leather. From here, the tents looked fragile, pressed between the hills on one side and the open frontier on the other. From here, Tobin could see the whole picture. Back in camp, Dushra was teaching Thomas to look at his own hands. She held his tiny fingers up in the afternoon light and made a low humming sound, and Thomas focused on his hands with the bewildered intensity of a person making a discovery. She did this every day now. Small things, small lessons, the ordinary magic of watching a mind begin to understand the world. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She was practiced at that. But when Thomas wrapped his fingers around her thumb and looked at her face with those wide, unfocused eyes, she let herself feel it. Just that, just the weight of a small hand holding on. That evening, Coram sought out Tobin near the edge of camp. "You work well," the elder said. It was not a compliment so much as an observation. "My father was a blacksmith," Tobin said. Coram looked at the repair work Tobin had done on the harnesses, running his thumb along the stitching, testing the tension. "Your people teach this young?" Before I could read, Coram set the harness down, looked at Tobin directly. 3 days remain. Have you decided?" Tobin met his eyes. "Not yet." Coram nodded slowly. "Good," he said. and his tone carried something that was not quite approval, and not quite warning, and not quite respect, all three of those things imperfectly mixed. He walked away without another word. Tobin stared at the harness on the ground in front of him. Then he picked it up and kept stitching. The fourth day was different. It rained. Not the heavy frontier storms that came in summer, but a slow, grey, patient rain that arrived before sunrise and settled in, like it planned to stay. The camp pulled under the broader tent coverings. Fires were moved inward. The horses stood under the stable roof and watched the weather with their usual calm philosophy. Tobin found himself in the supply tent with nowhere particular to be, going through the tools that had piled up in one corner. Broken handles, bent prongs, a small forge hammer with a cracked head that he suspected hadn't been used in over a year. He began sorting them without being asked. Vola appeared in the tent entrance, water beading off her leather, and stopped when she saw what he was doing. "Nobody's touched those in months," she said. "I can see that." She came in out of the rain and sat on a crate across from him, watched him work. "Can you fix the hammer?" she asked. "Depends on whether you have the materials. We have iron. We have a fire." "Then yes." Vola was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you come to us?" "There's a settlement 3 miles east, more of your kind." Tobin didn't look up from the hammer. 10 doors, he said simply. The rain fell on the tent roof, steady and unhurried. 10, Vola said. 10. Another silence, longer this time, the kind of silence that has weight in it. "My mother always said," Vola began, and then stopped, started again. "She said that honor is what you choose when everything else has already failed." She looked at Tobin. "You chose us when your other options ran out. That's not honor, but what you did after—" She tilted her head, working, listening, not pretending this is something it isn't. That might be. Tobin looked up at her. Vola looked back, steady, direct, asking nothing. In the main tent, Rata was sitting with Thomas while Dushra rested. Thomas was awake, examining the bone ornament Rata had set in front of him, reaching for it, grasping, losing it, reaching again. Each failure was immediate and followed immediately by another attempt. Rata observed this with the kind of attention she gave to plants, how things grew, how things tried. She thought about the human, about what he carried, grief and exhaustion and a promise he had no idea how to keep. She had treated injuries like that before, in the body. She knew what they looked like. She knew they healed differently from wounds made by blades. She also knew they healed. That was the part people forgot, in the middle of them. By evening the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Tobin sat with Thomas outside the main tent in the grey light, the baby bundled in wool, both of them watching the puddles on the ground as the drops hit and rippled. Thomas tracked each ripple with enormous concentration. Dushra came out and sat beside them. "He's going to be observant," she said, "like his father." Tobin looked at her. "How do you know I'm observant?" "Because you've been watching all 3 of us for 4 days, and you still haven't made a decision." It wasn't said with bitterness, more like a fact delivered sideways, with almost no edge at all. Tobin looked back at the puddles. "I know," he said. Thomas chose that moment to make the small, interested sound he made when something surprised him. A puddle suddenly went wide from a bigger drop, and his whole face registered the event. Both of them watched. Neither of them moved. The 5th morning arrived clear. The rain had left everything scrubbed and bright. The hills sharp against a pale sky, the red earth dark where it was still wet, the horses restless and moving in the stable. Tobin was up before first light. He sat outside his tent with a cup of water and watched the sun come over the eastern ridge in silence. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the oak tree. He thought about the 2 years they had been married and how they had built the cabin board by board, her handing him planks, him nailing them. both of them sunburned and arguing about where the window should go and then laughing about it later. He thought about 10 closed doors. He thought about a woman in the middle of a desert trail who had taken a dying baby from the arms of a stranger and fed him without asking anything in exchange. He thought about Dushra's face in the dark of that tent, not the grief on it, but what was underneath the grief, the steadiness, the refusal to let the loss be the end of anything. He knew what he was going to do. He had known for 2 days. The grief had made him wait, not because he was uncertain, but because saying it out loud meant something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The clan gathered at the ritual fire that evening, not the whole camp, but the elders, the warriors, the women who mattered to this decision, and the children who watched from a respectful distance, because children always understand, instinctively, when something important is happening. Corum stood at the center. Vola, Ratha, and Dushra stood to one side. Tobin stood across from them with Thomas in his arms. The baby was awake. His eyes moved from face to face as if he too understood. Tobin looked at the 3 women. He looked for a long time. "Vola," he said, "you are brave and strong. Any man would be honored to stand beside you." Vola met his eyes steadily. "Ratha, your wisdom reaches into places that words usually can't touch." Ratha inclined her head. "Dushra." He stopped. His voice held, but only by a thread. "My son loves you, and I know the weight you carry, because I carry one equal to it." Thomas made a small sound. Everyone heard it. "But I can't marry any of you. Not now. My heart is still in mourning, and you all deserve to be chosen whole, not by someone broken inside trying to honor an agreement." Silence. The fire crackled. Dushra stepped forward. "He is right," she said, not loudly, but in a way that carried. "I don't want a husband who pretends to be whole. I want someone who chooses me truly." Vola exhaled slowly. "I want to be chosen, not obeyed." Ratha said nothing. She nodded once. Corum looked at the 3 of them, looked at Tobin, then turned to the clan. "This stranger challenged our tradition, but he showed honor when he could have lied. My decision. Tobin stays in the Grakthar as a member. He works, he contributes, he raises his son. If the day comes when his heart has healed and he chooses someone among us in true love, he will be welcome to try." The fire crackled again. Somewhere in the back of the gathered crowd, someone began a low drumbeat, not a war rhythm, something slower, something that sounded like breathing. Tobin stood very still, Thomas against his chest, and let the sound wash over him. 6 months passed. The Grakthar camp changed in ways that were small, individually, and enormous together. The stable fence held. 3 tools that had been useless for a year were back in service. Tobin had built a small forge space between 2 rocks at the edge of camp. Nothing grand, just a stone basin and a bellows and the hammer with the repaired head. And twice a week, the sound of metal on metal rang out across the hills. In exchange, he learned, Ratha taught him which plants along the trail would close a wound, which would reduce a fever, which were simply beautiful and worth knowing. He learned the guttural words for north and south and water and fire and horse and, eventually, sun. When he pronounced them wrong, the children of the camp corrected him with a glee that he had not expected and that Thomas, watching from Dushra's arms, seemed to find very funny. Corum taught him nothing directly, but he allowed Tobin to sit near when the elders spoke, and listening was a kind of teaching. Drax stopped being suspicious somewhere around the 2nd month. He started being curious instead, which was a very different thing. They sparred once, carefully with wooden staves, and Drac won easily and didn't bother to hide his satisfaction, and Tobin laughed, which was the first time he had laughed in months, and both of them knew it. Thomas was 9 months old. He crawled everywhere, He had developed strong opinions about which direction he wanted to crawl in, and a complete disregard for any opinion other than his own. He had also developed a laugh, a sudden, total laugh that had nothing held back in it, and which had become, without anyone deciding it would be, the sound the whole camp organized itself quietly around, because there is something in a baby's laugh that refuses to let the people near it stay closed. On a spring afternoon, Tobin came around the side of the main tent and saw Dushra under the large tree at the camp's edge. She was lying in the grass with Thomas on her stomach, making faces at him that he returned with enormous concentration and occasional grabbing. She blew a raspberry on the side of his neck, and he dissolved into the laugh, total, helpless, whole. And she laughed too, and the sound came out of her like water from a crack in dry rock, easy, unguarded, real. Tobin stopped. He stood there and felt something move inside his chest. It was not grief. It was the opposite of grief. The thing that exists on the other side of grief when you have gone all the way through it without looking away. He had not known what it felt like until this moment. He recognized it only because it was different from everything that had come before. He walked over. Dushra looked up. She saw his face and went still. Not with alarm, just with attention. Thomas, denied the source of the noise, reached up and grabbed her braid with both hands, which she gently disentangled without looking at it. "When you took Thomas in that desert," Tobin said, sitting down in the grass beside her, "you weren't only saving him. I understand that now, and he saved you too." She looked at him with those steady, honest eyes. "I've felt something for you for a while," she said. "But I knew you needed time, so I waited." He took her hand. She did not take it back. They sat there in the grass for a while. Thomas, satisfied with the braid investigation, had shifted his attention to the hem of Tobin's boot and was conducting a thorough examination of its stitching. Above them, the tree moved in the afternoon wind. "I have land," Tobin said, "a few acres south of here. A cabin I built with my own hands. It was empty when I left. It doesn't have to stay empty." Dushra looked at him. "I'm not asking you to leave your clan," he said. "I'm asking you to build something new. With me. With Thomas. And with whatever comes after." He took a breath. "I know what it means. An orc and a human together, raising children on the frontier. People will talk. Both sides. But maybe that's exactly what this world needs. Not another treaty signed by leaders who've never spoken to each other in peace. Just two ordinary people choosing each other in truth and living that in front of everyone." Dushra was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was the first time Tobin had seen that particular smile, not the gentle smile of someone who tends to others, not the careful smile of someone who is protecting themselves. This was the smile of someone deciding, of someone arriving at a thing they have been walking toward for a long time without knowing it had a destination. "I accept," she said simply. When they walked back into camp, Vola and Ratha were already there, not waiting, exactly, but present in the way of people who knew something before it was said. Vola looked at them both with the satisfaction of someone whose investment has produced exactly the return she expected. Ratha said nothing and nodded once, which was the equivalent. Coram stood at the far edge of the firelight. He did not smile. He did something older than smiling, a slow lowering of his head that meant something had been recognized as true. The camp celebrated that night. Not a wedding yet. That would come later, when both of them were ready, when there had been more time and more seasons and more nights of Thomas's laugh, pulling the whole world gently open. What they celebrated tonight was simpler, a beginning, a cycle broken, two people choosing each other across a distance that the world had spent years building and calling natural. Tobin sat near the fire with Thomas in his lap and Dushra at his side. The baby had fallen asleep, watching the flames, his small fist curled against his own cheek. The drum was playing the slow, breathing rhythm again. Tobin looked up at the sky, at the width of stars above the hills, and spoke quietly enough that only the night could hear. "I kept my promise, Sarah. He's happy. He's healthy. He's surrounded by love. And I'm going to be all right. We're both going to be all right." The wind moved through the hills, soft, unhurried. Below the stars, Thomas slept without fear in a place that had not existed for him 6 months ago. Dushra's hand rested on Tobin's arm, the way a thing rests when it belongs there. 10 doors closed by his own kind, and one orc in the middle of the desert who opened her arms without hesitation. Prejudice teaches us who to fear. Life shows us who we can actually trust. Sometimes the hardest kind of courage is not facing your enemy. It's reaching out to the person the world taught you to fear and discovering that on the other side, there was only someone waiting to be seen. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.